I think SpongeBob's depiction of capitalism has actually contributed to a growing anti capitalist sentiment among young people, especially in the United States. Now, that's not to say we're all turning to communism or whatever, but we just want a system with a little less inequality. Just a little? And honestly, the more I think about it, the more SpongeBob comes across as just classic anti capitalist propaganda. If you live in the Western world, chances are money is a pretty important part of your life. We are taught that money is very important from a very young age. The more of it you have, the more successful and happy you will be. I grew up and still live in the United States where I think this message is particularly prominent. I mean, when I think of capitalism, I think of the United States. But most Americans are not particularly happy with how well the economy is doing, and they haven't been for quite some time. I mean, just look at the price of eggs.
This is a load of barnacles.
And there's a lot of fear out there. For example, most Americans fear medical emergencies because they can't afford to have one. And even if you have insurance, there's a good chance that your claims are going to get denied. And even if your claims don't get denied, you're going to have crazy out of pocket expenses, anyways, because American insurance is a scam. But this video is not about that. But it is actually pretty common for Americans to literally go bankrupt because of medical debt, which is just fucked up, man. As a result of this and economic conditions in general, I think over time, more and more Americans have become disillusioned with the system. And I think this feeling is particularly prevalent among Zoomers. Skibbity bussin', am I right, fellow Zoomers? So, how exactly has SpongeBob contributed to a rising anti capitalist sentiment among young people? Please, relax, make yourself comfy, and enjoy as I explain in this yap session. Basically, it's all because of one little guy. One cheap little guy. One despicable, cheap little guy. Of course, I am talking about the one and only Eugene Harold Krabs. One of the most despicable, greedy cheapskates in all of animation history. Mr. Krabs is objectively a terrible person. All he cares about is money, and he will completely disregard the well being of everybody around him in order to make a buck. We are introduced to Mr. Krabs in the very first episode of SpongeBob Help Wanted, but we don't really learn about him. We don't learn much about him in that episode, other than he owns the Krusty Krab and has an employee named Squidward, who we didn't even know was SpongeBob's neighbor at that point. We don't really get an idea of who Mr. Krabs is until episode 5A, Pizza Delivery. I know this episode probably doesn't stand out as one that's a good example of Mr. Krabs being a cheap asshole, but if you really think about it, the plot is pretty damning. Obviously, the Krusty Krab is a burger joint. They do not serve pizza. But when a customer calls and asks for one, Mr. Krabs uses some quick cartoon magic to turn a bunch of patties into a pizza. And then he makes Squidward deliver it, which again is not a service that the Krusty Krab normally offers. Assuming Bikini Bottom has any kind of labor laws, Mr. Krabs would probably be in violation of several, if not all of them, in this episode. And just to put the cherry on top, he makes SpongeBob go with Squidward, which is basically like torture for Squidward, and Mr. Krabs knows that. Now, if you're lucky, you have never worked in a job where something even vaguely along these lines has happened to you. But unfortunately, worker exploitation is fairly common. At least that's the impression I get living in the United States. Your results may vary. Anyways, Squidward and SpongeBob then go on this wacky adventure where they get sucked in by an underwater tornado and almost get hit by a truck. All in a day's work as far as Mr. Krabs is concerned. But this is really just the tip of the iceberg. At this point, we're only starting to get the vague idea of what Mr. Krabs is really like. There's still many important things that we don't know about him at this point, such as how much he pays his employees. Honestly, we kind of see a lot of red flags from Mr. Krabs before we even really know the extent of his greed. Like in Karate Choppers, he goes out of his way to prevent SpongeBob from participating in one of his hobbies, for seemingly no reason, even threatening to fire him over it, which again seems like a violation of the law. But then he completely reverses course once he realizes that he can use SpongeBob's hobby as a gimmick to sell more Krabby Patties. Thanks, Mr. Krabs. Very cool. Oddly, I think our first really good indication of how greedy Mr. Krabs is comes in episode 17A, Arrgh! The one where he leads SpongeBob and Patrick on adventure seeking the Flying Dutchman's treasure. Just look at the way he treats his crew in this episode. He forces them to travel far away from home. Patrick isn't even one of his regular employees, and they are largely traveling on foot without food and water. And when nightfall comes, Mr. Krabs forces SpongeBob and Patrick to sleep outside on the cold, hard ground while he gets to sleep in his tent, which is clearly more than big enough to fit all three of them inside. Then, of course, when they actually finally find the treasure, Mr. Krabs tries taking the whole thing for himself. Luckily, the episode ends with the Flying Dutchman awarding SpongeBob and Patrick because they're the ones who actually dug up the treasure, while Mr. Krabs got nothing. And that's more or less how it should work in real life, too. Obviously, managers and bosses, all the way up to CEOs or whatever, deserve their fair salaries. But all the people below them that do real hard work deserve good wages too. And quite frankly, the average American worker is grossly underpaid, while much of the money that should be going to them is going to mega rich CEOs and billionaires instead. In fact, between March 2020 and March 2024, the 10 richest Americans' net worth combined increased by $815 billion, more than doubling their net combined worth in 2020. And that's just of March 2024. Several of these guys have become way more rich, even in just the past year. Now, to give you a visualization of how much money this is, I have before me a cup of uncooked rice. A cup of uncooked rice has approximately 8,640 grains in it, at least according to Google. That number sounds made up, but I do not have the time or energy to fact check that, so let's just assume that's roughly how much rice we are looking at right here. Let's pretend that each grain, here is a single grain of rice, let's pretend this represents $1 million. This would mean that I have $8.64 billion on this plate right now. As of March of 2024, the 10 richest Americans have a combined net worth of $1.433 trillion, meaning I would need nearly 166 of these, 166 cups of uncooked rice, to represent that much money, again, with each grain representing $1 million. For context, there are approximately 50 cups of uncooked rice in a 20-pound bag of it. Now, obviously, this bag is mostly empty because I like to eat the food that I buy, but this is what a 20-pound bag of rice looks like. I would need 3 1/3 of these in order to get enough rice to represent that much money. Again, with each grain representing $1 million. Now let's say, for example, we decide that $1 million is too much
for a single grain of rice. Let's say instead, each grain represents $100,000. That is about how much money you could reasonably expect to make in a year if you have a pretty good job, so I think that's a fair comparison. In that case, obviously, 100,000 goes into a million 10 times, so everything would be multiplied by 10. Therefore, I would need 33 and a third 20-pound bags of rice to represent $1.433 trillion. And we can do this with any number we want, really. If you do $1,000, for example, then that would be 3,300 bags of rice. But
I think I made my point.
The Krusty Krab, I think, is a perfect allegory for all the money going to the richest people. Mr. Krabs famously, or perhaps infamously, pays SpongeBob and Squidward the least amount possible, which allows him to rake in as much profit as possible. There are countless instances throughout the show where Mr. Krabs nickels and dimes his employees. For example, in Squid on Strike, we see him charge Squidward $21 for breathing, talking, lollygagging, chewing, and existing. Existing! SpongeBob gets a similar bill that we never actually see, and he happily pays it because he's naive and thinks Mr. Krabs is a good boss. But that's a topic for a video in itself. I mean, imagine if you're a cashier and your boss came by and charged you $1 for standing behind the cash register. It's a crime enough that cashiers have to stand all day. I mean, why don't they have little stools back there? Let them sit down. Like, yeah, Squidward might not be the best person, but maybe he wouldn't be so grumpy all the time if he just got to sit down on the job a little bit. Personally, I don't understand how cashiers do it. I cannot stand still for 5 minutes, let alone a 4, 5, or 8-hour shift. So shout out to all the cashiers out there. You guys are heroes, and y'all deserve to be able to sit down at your job. And you probably deserve to be making a lot more money than you're making now. All of this just goes to show that Mr. Krabs does not value his employees at all. He just sees them as dollar signs. Perhaps the most extreme case of this is in Welcome to the Chum Bucket, when Mr. Krabs loses SpongeBob to Plankton in a bet, which forces him to work at the Chum Bucket. SpongeBob is by far the most important part of the Krusty Krab. Without him, the entire business is ruined, which we see in that very same episode, as at the end of it, before SpongeBob gets returned to Mr. Krabs, the Krusty Krab is about to go out of business. And yet, Mr. Krabs is willing to just willy-nilly give up his best employee like that. No one makes Krabby Patties the way SpongeBob does. If other people could make the perfect patty, then Wendy's would have had a lot more success with their sham of a promo. But I digress.
You promised these children,
A real Krabby Patty.
but all I saw out there was Chiefy the Cheapskate.
SpongeBob is the heart and soul of the Krusty Krab, and yet, just like that, Mr. Krabs tosses him away. And this kind of thing happens in real life too. Really good employees are often ignored or even fired because of the egos of their bosses, even when the employee is objectively correct. And a lot of businesses suffer because of this. Of course, in SpongeBob's case, he is also not paid what he deserves, but he sticks around anyways, just because that's how much he loves the Krusty Krab and grilling. In real life, though, employees do not choose to stay at their shitty jobs because they want to or because they love it. It's because they're forced to. A lot of workers can't afford to leave, so their employers are basically holding them hostage. In Big Pink Loser, we learn that Eugene actually charges his employees to work for them when they're first starting out.
And at $50 an hour, too. When I started working here, I had to pay Mr. Krabs $100 an hour.
To me, this is obviously meant to be satire about the worker-boss dynamic in capitalist economies. Typically, in real life, your average fast food restaurant manager is not really making that much more money than the rest of the employees. So this is a little bit of a stretch, but keep in mind, Mr. Krabs isn't just the manager of the Krusty Krab, he's also the owner. But this is another way that he's shooting himself in the foot. No one wants to work for Mr. Krabs. The only way he gets away with it is more of that cartoon magic. If he was running a restaurant in real life with just 2 employees, he'd be fine. We also know that Mr. Krabs does not value the environment for its intrinsic qualities. Like many real-life corporations, Mr. Krabs just sees the environment as resources that can be harvested for money. This is on full display in the episode Jellyfish Hunter, where he makes SpongeBob basically hunt jellyfish to extinction. We later learn that Mr. Krabs is abusing the jellyfish by forcing them into tight spaces and forcibly milking them and then just discarding them once they're completely out of jelly.
Blasted exercise craze!
This can be interpreted as an allegory for the dairy industry specifically, which also happens to be one of the worst industries when it comes to environmental impact and, of course, animal rights. But once again, all Mr. Krabs sees are dollar signs. He could not care less what the environmental impact of hunting a species to extinction would be. He could not care less if every single last jellyfish died, as long as it made him a tidy profit. And at the end of the day, that is essentially the same mentality that drives capitalism. I can also see this episode being an allegory for the fossil fuel industry, as companies like Chevron and BP clearly place their own profits over the well-being of their consumers and the health of the planet in general. Perhaps my favorite example of Mr. Krabs being a perfect allegory for greedy corporations comes in the first movie when he notices King Neptune coming to the Krusty Krab, so he jacks up the price of Krabby Patties to over $100.
$101 for a Krabby Patty? With cheese, Mr. Squidward!
I would say this is a pretty good analogy for a concept that all of us are now very familiar with, and that is crisis pricing. During the COVID thing, we saw companies jack up prices for a number of reasons. Many of these reasons were very legitimate. There were supply chain issues, increased shipping costs, and things like that. And to an extent, the increase in prices was reasonable and to be expected. However, one thing you might have noticed is that now that things have more or less returned to normal, the prices for a lot of things haven't really gone back to where they were before. So far, I really feel like I've only scratched the surface as to how bad of a person Mr. Krabs really is. But I think I've made my point. There are just so many more instances of him being a cheap asshole. Like when he builds Krabby Land out of literal garbage for kids to play on as some kind of amusement park. Or when he sells SpongeBob to the Flying Dutchman for 62 cents. Even Squidward thought that was ridiculous.
How could you trade SpongeBob for 62 cents? You think I could have gotten more?
Or that one episode where he forces SpongeBob to go on vacation and it literally saves him 5 cents. So what do you think about Mr. Krabs? Is he the worst character in SpongeBob? Is he the worst character in animation history? Do you think he's an allegory for greedy corporations and CEOs in capitalist economies? Did his behavior turn you against capitalism? I would really honestly love to know what you guys think, so please leave me comments in the comment section down below. That being said, that is the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, I will leave another one on screen now for you to watch next. And as always, take care. I'll catch you next time. And never forget to be yourself.